I'm Paul Shred, International Editor of the Cyber Express, and with me today is Steve Ingram, a longtime financial services cybersecurity consultant and a member of the board of threat intelligence leader Cyble. And we're here to talk about the financial services threat landscape. Welcome, Steve. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Paul, and it's great to be here.
All right. Well, why don't we start with some of the problems? What are the most common cybersecurity blind spots in financial services, and what can organizations do to stay ahead of those threats?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it's worth pausing before we jump into that to reflect, right, that we're on the cusp of something big here. This is, when you look at the geopolitical situation around the world, when you look at the pace of technological development and the deployment of AI and deepfakes and the issues we're dealing with, we're on the cusp of something big. Now, the issues are the same, right? So we started, say, for phishing, we started with general throw the cast the net out, general phishing to spear phishing to now AI-generated deepfakes. And I think while we recognize that, what we must also recognize is that the pace has changed, the landscape has changed, and our approach needs to change with it. So I think we do see some organizations moving. We do see some organizations moving faster, but to be really effective, we need to be anticipating the risks, anticipating the issues well before they arise. People talk about getting ahead of the curve. I don't think we can anymore, but we need to do everything we can to stay abreast with the curve.
Interesting. Huh.
Now,
sorry.
I was going to say, if we want to look at that even more deeply, I love stories. I like to sort of have a story theme that people can follow as well as a talk track. And as I mentioned to you, and you and I will recall Catch-22, written by Joseph Heller in 1961, because we went to school not as recently as many others on this on this call might have. But for those that haven't read Catch-22 and went to school after the 1980s or 90s, it's a novel about World War II bomber pilots in Italy from the US Air Force. But it's not really about war, it's not really about patriotism, but it is all about greed, bureaucracy, and self-interest. And just like cyber threats never stop evolving, the catchphrase, Catch-22, is about the number of flights that a pilot had to do before they could leave the theatre of war and return home. And every time those pilots got close to that target, that number would increase, and they'd have to do 24, 25, 26 flights. And just like the game we're in with cyber, it keeps moving. And I think, we recognize now that financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, any sector, right? The war against cyber is unwinnable. But the reality is we can't do nothing. So if we play the same rules that we've played all the time in the past, and we look at compliance and we look at risk mitigation and controls, we're just going to be done like a dinner. What we need to do now is recognize the rules have changed. We need to look for deeper wounds, not just surface vulnerabilities. And we need to accept that perfection is not the goal. We're not going to get 100% resilience. What we need to do is to improve our resilience and our adaptability, our agility, our speed to not just respond, but to predict. I guess the overview of Catch-22 is that for the pilots, it's a no-win situation. They get close to the target number of flights, and those number of flights get moved because of bureaucracy. The narrator is a fellow called Yossarian, and he realizes through the novel that the system is broken, and he has a lot of frustration and concern around what can he do to fix that. And I think a lot of the people I've seen in the last 25 or 30 years in consulting share that frustration. Like it doesn't matter how much you do against the threat actors, they do something else. It doesn't matter how many times you go to management to put out the need for a new system or a new tool, they push back. It doesn't matter how many times you go to the board, they push down. And one trick to the board is to collaborate with other organizations, because any board member will always ask, the first question they'll ask me is, what are the other banks doing? What are the other insurers doing? They're very concerned about not doing what the rest are doing, but they don't necessarily want to be the front runner and the pioneer. But anyway, back to Catch-22. One of the key scenes in Catch-22 is where another flyer, Snowden, is hit with shrapnel in this raid. And Yossarian tries to fix Snowden's injuries, and he fixes all the injuries in the front, and he's in despair because the medical kit from the aircraft has been gone, because there's another character, Milo, who is just a unregulated market capitalist and steals and gives away everything in the pursuit of profit. And he is a bit like the dark web that we have these days, that if you want it, you can get it from Milo. And even as we see, like the that Cyble have done in detecting the number of credentials, like I think it's a terabyte of credentials that they see on the dark web, every day. That's giving people the keys to the warehouse. So Milo doesn't even need to steal it. He can give the thieves, the threat actors, the keys, and they can come and take what they want. But anyway, Yossarian spends all this time fixing the visible wounds on Snowden, but Snowden dies anyway because he had horrendous wounds on his back. And I think we see that as well, that often management boards, even practitioners, are happy to fix what they can see, but they're not always ready to dig in more deeply. And we see prevailing across this is the absurdity of leadership, of compliance, of short-termism. And it's fascinating. I was listening to this podcast the other day, Article 51, I think they're called. They're an NGO, and they were looking at, it was called Cyber with the Chinese character. And they talked about how the Chinese are very strategic with their approach, in that they're deploying hardware across the world as effectively as they can. They're selling software as rapidly as they can. And then they're sharing their governance models to normalize their approach to what they see as good cyber practice across countries, across Africa, Asia Pacific, South America, with a view to influencing long term. And I do get frustrated in our Western world, where our sort of long term is 3 months, not 30 years. And we don't have that same level of collaboration and cooperation that we should have. And I think that ties back into Catch-22. It's all around just getting through the here and now, and it's going to be someone else's problem later. So we'll move on. And I think the climax is that Yossarian realizes the only way to win the game is to play differently. And in his case, he leaves the Air Force, he deserts. Well, we're not saying we desert, but we just need to think about how do we do things differently and not just do what we've doggedly done consistently over the years. And I think the overall message is to accept the paradox, We won't win, but we still need to play. We need to play harder than ever. So I rambled for a little bit there. I don't know if that was of interest or not, Paul.
Yeah, that was great stuff. I mean, it actually got me thinking. So companies in this area need to worry about two things. They need to worry about their own IT, their own, cloud instances and things like that. But they also need to worry about the customer too, because they can also be breached. Their account credentials can wind up on the dark web or something like that. They can fall victim to deep fake. So it seems like an area that's as sensitive and as big a target as this just has such a huge threat surface that they have to worry about, such a big attack surface. And so I'm just wondering, how do you deal with all those threats, and what do you see here too?
Yeah, great question. So the most effective CISOs I've seen in financial services are those that think about their customer's customer. They don't think about the retail division of their bank, the wholesale division of their wealth and asset management program as their customer. They think about the retail division's customers as their customer. So you make a decision here around security, but you really need to factor in how that impacts and how that protects your customer's customer. How does, like with your bank, when they make a decision in the CISO world, how does that affect you as a customer? Because that will affect your loyalty, but it will also affect your regard, your positive regard for them looking after their safety. Some years ago, I was a general manager at a bank, and I did a restructure of the finance and risk management division. And I noted that in our outbound fraud call center, we'd call people to say, are you really buying a refrigerator in Charlotte right now? And I'd say, well, no, I'm not in Charlotte. I'm in Dallas, and I'm not buying a refrigerator. And initially, people will be a little bit, what, Paul, what are you watching me? Are you monitoring me? Then they realize you're looking out for me. I did try and convert that, being young and enthusiastic and naive. I did try and then see if we could add an outbound sales call to that call, such as, oh, great. So then, Paul, how's your mortgage going? But I realized that, one, that destroyed any goodwill we just created. And two, people that are really good at fraud centers or outbound calls for fraud and cyber aren't necessarily great mortgage sellers. So it didn't really work. But I think the banks that do it best are those that allow the CISO to take a strategic role in the organization, to enable the future of the organization, and give them the space and the head cover to think about how the decisions of his team or her team impact on your customer's customer.
Interesting. So,
so if we tie that back to Catch-22, again, it is just breaking through that bureaucracy. And I see it often. You'll see fantastic people in the cyberspace who have a strategic outlook, who have an enabling mindset, but they get so busy. You know, Taiwan, the government agencies in Taiwan, according to that podcast I was listening to, 2.4 million attacks per day or incidents per day they experience, you know. So often, because we're under-resourced and overstretched, just like in Catch-22 and the pilots, we need to do so much. It's just hard to keep the lights on, hard to keep the operations going. So if we comply with that, then partly that's our problem, right? What we've got to do is look to do things differently, like Cyble do. You know, get in on the dark side. Not that everyone should do this, but you need someone safe to go into the dark side of the web for you, an agent to go into the dark side of the web for you, and try and stop attacks before they're kinetic. Try and capture credentials before they become valuable to someone. Try and identify as soon as possible where you or your customers or your customers' customers have been identified, and act on that before they're compromised. Sorry, I'm getting excited.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's some great info. So you mentioned some things that they can do. You know, just a kind of a side thought here, but it seems to me that this is one area where I see more prescriptive regulations than any other. Like if you've seen, I don't know, it's like maybe it's FFIEC and SEBI in India. There's, you know, there are these long documents of everything that they're supposed to be doing, but you know, but that kind of seems to fit your view that we're being frozen kind of into a way of reacting. And I'm wondering if there are other directions you think people should be going in. Are there other measures they should be, you know, they should be implementing in cybersecurity?
There's two dimensions to that question. One is, yeah, regulation is typically the dumbest common denominator, not the best. And when I worked in financial services with EY and I ran that for the Americas, you know, you'd see in banking, the regulations would come out and I'd have to spend $10. And so they go, well, how do we spend $10 now and quickly, and let's get this issue off our back and let's move on. In the wealth and asset management area, it'd be that's $10. Let's do that, but how do we turn that $10 into 15? And in insurance, it'd be that's $10, but can we do it for 8? You know, there was different mindset, and that's the challenge of regulations, that you're covering a big, broad field. And then even within banking capital markets, from huge monolithic organizations to small community banks, it's hard to get a set of regulations that covers everyone. But that's the sad thing too. People then rely on the regulations. They'll you know, I've seen so many organizations have to spend tens of millions of dollars and disrupt their organization in an incredible way while they repair their identity and access management programs. reality is they shouldn't need the regulator to tell them that they've got to repair their identity and access management programs, right? That should be something they do themselves as good practice. But the problem is people, if it's heavily regulated, people rely on the regulations and they'll say, well, wait for that. Instead of investing up front and not having that burden and not having that business disruption, they wait till they have to do something. And again, it comes back to catch-22. Let the bureaucracy guide us. Let's not, drive a course ourselves. So I think regulation's needed because people typically won't do the right thing unless they really have to, which is a sad indictment on how we've been conditioned in the world today. The other side is that you're right, there's all these new regulations coming out across the world, but I suspect in the US that we'll have there'll be a reduced regulatory environment for the foreseeable future. I think it just goes hand in hand with the approach the administration has at the moment. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what's going to happen. Regulations will be less intense and will be less policed, for want of a better term. Now, if I go back to the earlier analogy that I gave, or no, it's an example, not an analogy, from Article 51's webcast, that China, for example, are strategic, sell hardware, sell software, sell governance and approaches, collaborate, do joint exercises, and normalize their approach to a broader international community. Now more than ever, we have a need to self-regulate, to not wait for anyone to come to us and say you've done the wrong thing, but to actually look ourselves at what we need to do to make sure that our customers are protected, are secure, and beyond that, that the national economy and the global economy is connected, is secure, is safe, protected, not connected, is safe and resilient so that people can conduct business with predictable outcomes.
Yeah. Are there better ways that public entities and private ones can collaborate to get to that better cyber resilience?
100%. So, we talked about regulations and legislation. No government, not even if every government in the world got together, I don't believe we could legislate our way out of the cyber risks that we face today, particularly with AI and deepfakes. Not possible. I don't think if every law enforcement agency came together in the world, we could police our way out of people doing the wrong thing. And like I used to work in organised crime and narcotics back in the 80s and 90s, and we'd work on, I worked on operations that could go for 2 or 3 years, and we would work on what we'd call good crooks, high-level major narcotic importers. And they wake up every day knowing that the police are probably going to surveil them, knowing that the police have probably intercepted their telephone, knowing that there's probably listening devices, that they just choose. These people could be great in business. If they went legitimate, they could be great businessmen, but they choose to be criminals, and we'll always have that. So you then come to the third dimension of this triangle, which is the private sector. I think if we can bring the law enforcement, the government, and the private sector together more collaboratively, we've got a better chance of making our economic system more resilient, of making our national economy more reliable through that collaboration. In the US, we've got the ISACs, FS ISAC, I'm going to next week in New Orleans, and that's a phenomenal organisation, and it brings people together. And there's, I think, another 20 or so ISACs around. But what we need is more collaboration between all of these and internationally to work together. I spent the last 2 years, I was in Australia in 2017-18, really trying to drive the joint cybersecurity centres and more collaboration between the private and public sector. And I think it had good headway. But again, we need to make sure there's systemic responses, not heroic responses. And I don't think we had enough time to systemize it, but certainly they're moving in the right direction for that collaboration. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, actually, so does that work as like a high level working group, or what do you do
Yeah.
to put something like that into place?
Yeah, so you have like a joint cybersecurity center, which is say a board, and you have law enforcement, government, and private sector representation. The ideal that we didn't quite get to, but is still achievable in any country, is a cyber fusion center, run as a not-for-profit ideally, where information can be shared in a safe harbor manner, right? So there was an act in the US a few years back around, or actually I think about 10 years ago, around sharing threat intelligence. But I don't think anyone's really leveraged it because people are concerned about any consequences from the regulator or from a third party for sharing threat intelligence. What we need is a safe harbor so that everyone can share information instantly and share it with you saying, look, Paul, I haven't qualified this, but these are some threat indicators I'm seeing. Or, Paul, we've found your credentials on the dark web. We need to work together to do something about this, right? I had some people say, well, we can't do that because the threat actors will know what we're doing. And I said, what will they know? They will know that we know what they know. What's the problem, right? I don't see the negative. But I think an ideal would be a non-for-profit cyber fusion center that just ingested and shared threat intelligence almost in a real-time basis.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that stuff is out there. So, so basically anyone could go find it if they really wanted to,
Yeah. So you look at some of the work that Cyble do, like in the info stealers and the cybercrime ecosystem, right? It starts with phishing emails, goes to stolen credentials, moves on to people gaining initial access. There's an access broker that will share that and sell that, and goes on to ransom affiliates and then the cybercrime forum. Every step in that process, there was an exchange. It's not one person from start to finish doing that. It gets moved around just like it is in a market, right? Just like if you're originating a mortgage, you've got the broker, you've got the originator, you've got the underwriter and so forth. It's the same. So at every one of those interchanges, there's an opportunity for Cyble, for example, monitoring the dark web to identify that action and to stop an attack before it actually becomes kinetic. If you could share that sort of insight and that sort of information quickly and without fear of harm, we'd be in a much more resilient market.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've actually looked at companies that have been hit by ransomware, and you see that their credentials were actually on the dark web for months leading up to that, and it just sometimes just simple monitoring can make such a difference.
And so many incidents, major incidents that have been recognized throughout the years, it's like overnight. It might be Equifax or whatever, but it wasn't overnight, and it was known for some time before it was became public, and the damage continues, right? The damage continues, and it could have been stopped sooner or quicker. And I do get concerned that as we deregulate the environment in the coming months, weeks, or years, that some people will see that as a get out of jail free. But I think you're just really not doing the right maintenance on your security, and we're opening the doors for more threat actor activity. We need to regulate ourselves honestly and with integrity.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume that in finance that customer opinion matters more. I mean, if you wind up getting breached and you've got people's money, that's going to scare them, and they might look elsewhere. So I would hope that customer pressure or the desire to be seen on good terms by them would be a motivating factor here.
I think it was at one stage, and I think organisations realise now that it's so prolific that it's Paul got attacked this week, it's going to be Steve next week, it'll be Binu the week after. So as much as it does give you bad press for a short period, it's typically not that long that someone else takes the mantle. Certainly you would have some percentage of your customer base would move on because they were so aggrieved by the actions, but it's not as widespread as you might have thought in the past. So again, it's important for those in the CISO community, for those cyber practitioners, to really be looking at enabling the business, sharing their thoughts with their colleagues, across the organization on how they can help enable the business and looking at the positive outcomes, not just stopping, but actually enabling.
Okay, let's talk about partners for a little bit, like with all the cloud services and fintech partners and things like that. What can financial institutions do to strengthen third-party risk management? Are there things they can do there as their partner network grows?
Sure. Again, don't go. I don't think it's as bad as it was, say, 10 or so years ago. But outsourcing a process doesn't outsource your problem. It's still your brand attached to that outcome at the end of the day. So you need to make sure that you're treating your partners as attentively as you would your own systems in your own organizations, that you are really, demanding that you've got a right to access and test and that they can validate the security that they're applying. It's a great threat vector for attackers, because instead of going from one to one, you can go from one to many, as we've seen. And I think SolarWinds and such were great examples. But again, it's incumbent on those service providers to alert their customers as quickly as possible, instantly almost, and even on the basis that not validated yet, but this could be the problem. And I think that's what I'm looking for. More scrutiny, don't tell me, show me. Don't just accept trust, but earn the trust and really prove that you've got the right systems in place and you're looking after me and my customers and my customer's customer.
Yeah. We've touched on so many different problems here and challenges. Is there any way to break it down and give people some basics that they should be doing?
I think it'll be a good way to wrap up, because I have been rattling on for a while, but I think back to catch-22, right? The system's broken. There's still common blind spots. We've still got third party and supply chain risks. We've still got credential-based attacks, and there's internal risks. We need to move to zero trust, right? We've got to move to limiting people's ability to dive across within the organization. But we're not doing that well enough yet. We need to do more. We don't want to, as in Yassarian and Snowden, don't treat the obvious, right? Don't just treat what's visible to you and what the board sees, right? You've got to look for emerging issues. You've got to look at if you haven't, already worked it out, how are AI deepfakes going to impact your organization? Synthetic IDs. What are you going to do to protect and make your organization resilient against those? How do we deal with I'm amazed that ransomware is just continuing to become a bigger and bigger issue, and we haven't been able to get on top of it. But again, maybe it's another example. When I was in banking some years ago, the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, we had an issue. This is 20 odd years. We had an issue with credit card fraud, and we knew the other banks had credit card fraud issues. So I pulled together the 4 major banks, the federal police, the 2 major state police agencies, and a few other organisations, and we had a one-day workshop. And we worked out that if we shared our data, we could identify the point of compromise. And we collected our data, we shared it, the police analysed it, we identified a number of gas stations in Sydney and Melbourne that were set up for no other purpose than to harvest credit card details. They even had it going back to PIN number stuff, right, not tap and go. That's how old it is, but they had cameras set up just to get the PIN numbers. And then they worked out that if they held that data for 3, 4, 5 months before they shared it, it was harder for us to identify the points of compromise. So my point here is, you might be a manager in threat intel in a medium tier bank. Talk to your boss first, but go and reach out to the other banks. What can you share if you're not doing it already? What can you do collaboratively? And then how do you expand that to include the regulator, to include law enforcement, to how do we think beyond the immediate and look at where we can leverage, greater capacity? I come back to that absurdity of compliance leadership, and we need to move away from that, and we need to become right now on the front foot and proactive. We need to look at automating threat detection, about using IA models to monitor the dark web, stop attacks before they get mobile, before they're kinetic. and play harder now than we've ever played before. I think the rules of engagement we've had in the past are flawed now. I don't think they work for the current situation we're facing. And I think, and it's probably okay, but perfection's not the target here. 100% resilience is not the target here, but we need to have an agile model of resilience and adaptability and keep addressing all of these, not even new risks, but new plays on old risks.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, we've been talking with Steve Ingram about the financial services threat landscape. And Steve, thank you so much for your time. It's been really great. And thanks to our audience also for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for sharing the time.